Hi, everybody. It's Amanda Gneininger from Progress, Texas. I'm subbing in again for Satvik this week. I'm joined this week by our advocacy manager, Diana Gomez, communications manager, Wesley Story, and executive director, Ed Espinoza. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about police reform and budget negotiations at the Texas legislature. So just kind of to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about some big news that I heard out in California. Caitlyn Jenner just announced that she'd be running for California governor as a Republican this morning. And this week I know we saw that Matthew McConaughey seems to be polling better than Greg Abbott as the Texas governor. So what does everybody think about all these celebrities running for office lately? Diana, or Wes, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my thoughts on Caitlyn Jenner are obviously no, because she's running on the Republican ticket. But for McConaughey, the news from this week, I mean, I've been going back and forth, and I know we've talked about this previously. Folks have heard me talk about it, and I would prefer someone who has strong stances on certain issues. And, we really haven't heard much from McConaughey about what his politics are. But also now knowing that he's polling better than Abbott does give me a little bit of pause. And it's great to think that he could maybe beat him. So I'd still like to know what his politics are, but I think I'm a little bit more accepting of that possibility now that I have that information.
Yeah. As far as McConaughey goes, I agree. I mean, honestly, I give a shit about experience. That to me is less important than whether or not somebody can fund a campaign, has the name recognition to win, and then has the values to be able to set a good agenda. Because let's face it, that's what we need right now in Texas. Experience is nice, but it's a nice to have, not a need to have. The need to have is whether or not somebody can win. I don't think that McConaughey is the answer. He could be, but we have a lot of campaign left in front of us. As far as Caitlyn Jenner, the question that lingers in my mind is, Caitlyn Jenner is a Republican. What does that party have to do to lose her support? Because I feel like she is the antithesis of everything that a Republican is. Like, I think they keep trying to get her to leave, and she stays, but it's really not a good fit. I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled by it.
Yeah, I also puzzled, but also agreeing with Wesley a bit. I know I had also agreed prior about my feelings regarding Matthew McConaughey. But also after seeing those poll numbers, I thought, hold on a second. Okay, this is kind of interesting and cool. Maybe this is a first step to get rid of Greg Abbott. That would be awesome. I feel a lot more better knowing if McConaughey had any, really progressive stances on stuff. Besides marijuana, I'm going to assume what that stance is.
Safe bet.
Yeah. So that's cool. But, it'd be cool if he brought in a really, diverse, amazing Texan for lieutenant governor. That would be really cool, too. Caitlyn, gosh, such a hot mess. I think it would be so awesome. Like you were saying, Ed, you got to have that funding, right? And that name recognition to go out and win a seat like this. I'd really love to see, and if McConaughey could have a role in this, that would be great too. But I'd really love to see out of Texas an initiative to really grow our own progressive candidates and to put funding behind that. Gosh, that would be so great. And if we could pick out McConaughey to help with that, that would be awesome. But it's the time is now to do that, or else all we're left with is, like a Hollywood Squares. Like, who would you pick to run our entire country?
And I want to give a plug to some progressive voices out there, because it is interesting and it's fun to talk about celebrities. And I think this is probably like the third or fourth time we've talked about McConaughey in like 3 or 4 weeks. And why wouldn't we, right? It's like the big news. But of course, there's Beto O'Rourke. And there's Julian Castro, whose names come up. But then you've also got other upstarts like Lena Hidalgo out of Harris County. Not really an upstart, but like a well-known name up in Dallas County is Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins. And then there's so many people in the legislature. I think the thing to keep in mind at this point is that it's April, right? And the next year's primary is supposed to be in March, but who knows? We won't even get the census data until September 30th. So we can't have maps until October the earliest. So there's just so much runway in front of us right now.
Definitely. I think one runway maybe we moved down a little bit further along the way was looking at police reform and police accountability. So we know this week we had the really amazing verdict of Derek Chauvin's guilt on 3 counts. I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on this. Ed, do you want to start us off?
I'll just say that I think the guilty verdicts were a relief. We're so used to seeing things go. We're so used to seeing like situations like this where there's no accountability. And I think that all of us were kind of tied up in knots ahead of time. And I wouldn't really describe it as joy, because I don't think there's anything joyous about this. But there definitely was a sense of relief. It doesn't mean that the system is fixed. It doesn't mean that there's not a ton of work to do, because I think the answer to both those is it's not fixed and there's a ton of work to do. But it's a start. And there's a lot of things we can do. And fortunately, there's 3 bills in the Texas legislature right now that address many of the issues that are systemic in our society and amongst the police. I'll let Diana and Wesley get a little bit more into detail of what's in those bills. But I think that this was an important week. If you didn't see Biden's speech, I encourage you looking it up. If you want something quicker, look for the tweet that Obama put up. Both very good statements in regards to what's happening here. I'll try and find those and see if I can pass them on to you to put in the chat.
And before we get into the bills, Ed, I just want to expand on some of the stuff you talked about and just what I've been seeing as far as the reaction to this verdict. You know, like you said, this was accountability. It wasn't justice. Justice would be if George Floyd was here today. It would be if he was allowed to see his daughter grow up. And the fact is, if there was more accountability like this in the past, then this might not have happened to begin with. And so this was a step in the right direction, but think about all that it took to get us here. Think about the protests and everything that had to happen before this guilty verdict came out. And then on top of that, when you think about how many other situations where the police were able to get away with it and there wasn't a guilty verdict, more often than not, police are not found guilty in these situations. Sometimes they don't even necessarily go to trial. So like you said, this fight is really far from over. I keep thinking about if there hadn't been cameras there to record this. Cell phones are a huge part of what's caused this movement to go forward, because we now have a record of all of these incidents happening and nothing being gone. But just think about all of the things that we're not aware of. And so we really are far from being able to say, oh, we've been successful, like we have police reform. No. And so these bills that we're about to talk about and that Diana, I think, may expand on, they're so important because this issue is still here. One guilty verdict, or I guess 3, doesn't change that this is a huge issue in our country.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the fact that we had to go through this, long grueling trial, there was video, we watched the murder happen, and yet we still had to prove that what we watched was actually real. And that's just wild to me. And the fact that, Black folks have to endure this so much more in this country than any other population, as well as, followed by a lot of other communities of color. But here in Texas, there is an opportunity to try and reform some of this really bad, some of these really bad parts of our criminal justice system, starting with our own version of the George Floyd Act. Folks should not forget that George Floyd is from Texas. His family, he has a lot of family in Houston. And so it's really important that we keep that in our hearts and pass the George Floyd Act in his legacy. Right now it is HB 88, but it basically is a police use force accountability omnibus bill. So it has a whole lot of stuff to try to overturn in terms of police reform. And it was introduced by Representative Thompson and Senator Royce West. A whole bunch of reforms are in there. Another one too, besides the George Floyd Act, that want to echo and uplift is the Breonna Taylor bill. That is an amazing bill pushed by Representative Jasmine Crockett, along with others, including James Tallarico. But it's trying to ban the use of no-knock warrants. Echoing back to what happened to Breonna Taylor in Kentucky when police fatally shot her. And a third one that's on there too is the Brandon Signs Act that has also been introduced by Jasmine Crockett. And what's really fascinating is that Jasmine Crockett is an attorney, and she was the one that was representing this family and in this case. And so, this is all, we have a lot of Texas connections here. We have to pass this. This is our chance to call our representatives to tell them to be equitable and to pass these reforms. Okay,
so you said that the Breonna Taylor Act seeks to eliminate no-knock warrants.
Mm-hmm.
What was the other one? Is the Brandon Signs Act, and what does that one seek to do?
So that one seeks to prohibit police officers from using less quote unquote lethal devices to control crowds. So for example, those bean bags that are tossed, a lot of things that are, quote unquote alternatives, and that police might consider not as lethal, but sometimes they often are even more lethal and do even way more damage than a bullet. And, we shouldn't be going back and forth as to, well, what kind of weapon is okay? It's no, we need to de-escalate instead of trying to choose our weapons.
Especially on nonviolent gatherings, right? Because it's one thing if it is a violent gathering, like maybe when we saw at the U.S. Capitol, but nonviolent gatherings where people are peacefully protesting, like we see so much here around Texas, I think is different. And then just to wrap up the three, I think the George Floyd Act, is that the one that addresses qualified immunity and or excessive force?
Yes. Including the excessive force of using chokeholds. It includes a whole lot of stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how would these bills move us towards creating safer communities? Because just after the verdict came down, we saw when people were rejoicing that Black lives did matter, we saw another Black life taken away, Ma'Khia Bryant. How would these different reforms really make a safer community for everyone?
Something I think that's important to understand is that this problem is systemic, and it's written into our laws. So as Ed was mentioning with the George Floyd Act addressing the qualified immunity doctrine, that's a doctrine that really allows police to get away with a whole lot of stuff that they shouldn't be, a regular person is not able to get away with. And so these things are written into our laws. And so legislative intervention is necessary in order to regulate what our police officers are able to do and what they cannot do. So current legal and enforceable police tactics really have a root in the violence that takes place and that's used against Black and brown Texans. And so I think that that's one important way to understand this, is that this is addressing a systemic problem that's written into Texas law, and it's also nationally an issue. But we have to start with the laws in order to see change. And the laws are what also lead to accountability for police officers. Because if that accountability isn't there and they're able to continue to get away with these actions, then it's never going to change.
Yeah, I totally agree with the accountability piece. I think accountability needs to be created. I'm sure especially Black and brown communities are sick of seeing their communities murdered one by one, not only locally, in their streets, but also on television every day, all the time. And the fact that right after that verdict of guilty came in earlier this week, right after that, a young teenage girl was killed. We're tired of that. Things need to happen to stop this. Like Wesley was saying, we need to create accountability. People need to know if you don't do your job well, if you, and especially if you kill someone, there have to be consequences. We can't let there not be consequences anymore. And so this would be these would be really great steps in the right direction. We need this to happen, and not tomorrow, but now.
Yeah, I can't agree more with that. A lot of the things that are happening right now in the Texas legislature kind of impacts communities in a lot of different ways as well. This week we were looking at the Texas budget. So for people that aren't familiar with what the budget is and what it does, Wes, can you kind of give us a basic overview of what the Texas budget is?
Yes, I'll try to keep it as basic as possible because I know the budget is a really difficult, complicated discussion and not sexy. A lot of people, I think, kind of tune out when they hear about money and finances. But the budget is actually super important here in Texas. It's actually the one thing that the lawmakers have to complete and pass before the end of the legislative session, which is why it's such a big deal. Like, that's why they're all there. Obviously, they're there to do more stuff and pass other important legislation, but this is like the one thing that they're required to get done before the end of the legislative session. And we have to pass the budget because it determines how much money is allocated to different state agencies so that they can take care of all the duties that they've been tasked with doing in order to serve the people of Texas. The budget actually, it determines the funding for the following 2 fiscal years. So it's not just for 2022, but I believe 2023 as well. And the budget week, which is what was taking place this week, was just a really small part of the overall process for determining the budget. It actually, this process starts the year before the legislative session begins, and it goes through a lot of different state agencies, legislative budget boards. The budget goes through so many changes before it was in the full Texas House this week, where our representatives were debating on different amendments and different changes to make to the budget.
And a lot of shenanigans I hear happens in kind of budget weeks and when we're discussing, what the money is doing, what the money can do. It seems to me that there's a lot of opportunity for people to kind of slip in bad policy just by based on how we fund things. Diana, did you see any bad budget amendments go through this week?
Yes, very bad and wild and unbelievable. One of the amendments that went in was to provide funding for CPCs, and these are crisis pregnancy centers. That's not what they should be called. They should be called FPCs, fake pregnancy centers. They are really deceptive, and they receive money from the state of Texas, and millions of our tax dollars go into funding these fake crisis pregnancy centers. And what they really do is, instead of offering healthcare, they are sort of running this alternatives to abortion programs. And like I said, there's zero accountability for us to us taxpayers, and they're fake clinics, and they are run by anti-choice organizations. And just to think of how those millions of dollars could have been spent actually going into providing Texans healthcare, essential healthcare like abortion services, would be great. And it's just really shameful that this one went through.
Ed, did you see any kind of disappointments around, maybe I heard Medicaid was a bit of a disappointment this week?
I mean, it's Texas legislature is always going to be full of disappointments, right? The one thing you can rely on the legislature for is that it will always deliver disappointments to you, even when you're not expecting it. Medicaid was a big thing. Look, Texas is the most uninsured state in the nation. We have the most people who are in need of access to affordable care. And Texas has been dragging its feet on an affordable care program for a decade, since 2010. And they had a chance to incorporate some sort of Medicaid expansion, whether you call it that or not. I think in the end, they had something that was called like the Texas Affordable Care Program, or I can't remember exactly what it was called. And they didn't pass it. It lost by 7 votes. And in losing by 7 votes, the state is passing up $100 billion. That's a billion with a B. $100 billion in federal funding that could have come with it to help the state get to a Medicaid expansion program. So it's disappointing, but, not surprising.
Yeah. That's, we've got one thing that I'll link in the show notes if you're listening, and I'm putting it in the chat here. But it seems like, that Medicaid keeps kicking the can down the road a little bit. What happened with the Biden administration this week, Ed?
I think Wesley knows a thing or two about this. Wesley, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So part of the reason that I think this week, especially Medicaid, it was so disappointing that it wasn't passed is because the Biden administration recently sent a message really to the entire state of Texas telling us that we needed to get our act together. The administration is refusing to expand the Medicaid waiver that Republicans apply for, I think, every year, and they've been doing so for almost a decade. It's really this thing that they've been abusing because they've been taking money from the federal government, but continuing to refuse to expand Medicaid and open up healthcare accessibility for over 1 million Texans, I think it's estimated, would be impacted if we were to expand Medicaid in our state. And so by refusing to expand that waiver, they were really sending a message to the Texas legislator that now is the time to expand Medicaid. You know, this is not something that we're going to be able to continue getting away with. And I think that we were hoping that because that message was sent right ahead of the budget discussions and negotiations, that maybe that would lead to some lawmakers either having a change of heart or actually really just sticking true to the words that they've told us in the past. You know, before this session even started, a lot of Texas Republicans were in favor of potentially expanding Medicaid. And I think that maybe, I don't know if some polling came out that their folks weren't in favor of it, but we know that a majority of Texans are in favor of expanding Medicaid. And so it's kind of ridiculous that they've continued to not vote for that legislation. But again, it was really disappointing that it didn't end up passing.
Yeah, Medicaid expansion, affordable care in general is popular in Texas. There were 8 Republican votes to expand this heading into the vote. Only one of those votes was cast. The other 7, they were called into the principal's office, you know, Speaker Phelan's office, and told they couldn't vote for it. And the hardest thing to believe, I go back to that $100 billion. I thought Republicans liked money. What happened here? This was not just money; it was free money.
It seems like the Republicans are leaving a lot of money on the table in a lot of different places. I mean, one of those places. I mean, I also thought Texas Republicans really liked business, and I know Wes, can you kind of talk to me about some of the budget amendments that dealt with that kind of slapped businesses for coming out against bad voting rights reforms?
Yeah, so quite a few of the Texas Republicans, Briscoe Cain was one of them, filed amendments that sought retribution really for companies that had spoken out against voter suppression legislation over the past few weeks. So that's businesses like Dell and American Airlines. They introduced amendments. One of them, for example, from Briscoe Cain, would withhold certain funds from any corporations that publicly threatened adverse action against the state based off of legislation related to election integrity. Cain, there were some successes when this was, as far as this was concerned, because there were quite a few bills like that, or quite a few amendments that were filed like this from other Republicans as well. Cain ended up withdrawing his amendment, and a few of the others failed to pass. That was largely due to our Democratic lawmakers who honestly were being really smart about the way that they were calling out certain things in these amendments. So for example, I know that Representative Busey, he had a point of order, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but basically that's just hey, there's something wrong with your bill that would make it unable to pass, and he basically destroyed one of the bills. So maybe actually Rep. Busey should be our parliamentary guru instead of Briscoe Cain. But there was one bill that ended up passing, and it was a lot broader, so it wasn't election related necessarily, but it did talk about maybe withholding funds from companies that speak out on certain legislation. And this is really just a First Amendment issue. Political speech is a constitutionally protected part of the First Amendment. And so if this bill or if this amendment does move forward, I can almost guarantee that there will be lawsuits against it because it's just fundamentally like unconstitutional. And I think it's really funny that, or hypocritical really, that Republicans are speaking out against these companies, but often political speech when it comes to corporations benefits Republicans. So I'm just wondering, are they going to commit to never meeting with corporate lobbyists ever again? Are we to look forward to them joining our fight against overreaching corporate power in government. This is a very like progressive stance that they tend to be taking, but it's because it's something that goes against their legislation. And so that's why they're taking it.
Being liberal to own the libs. I love it.
Exactly.
In 2017, I think it was 17, maybe it was 19, where Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick talked about the Liberal Texas Association of Business, where it was like, record scratch, what?
I mean, there seems like Republicans can be doing a lot better things with their time than creating another foray into the Supreme Court dealing with First Amendment issues. Diana, are there things that you think that are really more worth our time and more worth the legislators' time in the budget or just generally?
So many things. Literally anything besides what they're doing right now would be awesome. And what they're doing right now is, one, they're not doing their jobs in leading Texans and protecting our best interests. What they are doing is attacking a lot of our fundamental rights to access health care, whether that be abortion care or denying health care to trans kids. They're attacking our right to vote, such a fundamental thing. And so many other things. Progress Texas, we mentioned this before, but we conducted a poll after the winter storm, polling Texans across the state, asking y'all, what do you want your representatives to prioritize in the Capitol? And the number one thing y'all mentioned was COVID relief. That would be so amazing, so awesome. Also figuring out what's up with this power grid. We have these crises we're dealing with right now, and that's what leaders are supposed to do, is to figure out how to deal with crisis and to help us. Something
But
really
Diana,
great.
We fixed COVID. We don't have COVID in Texas.
Right.
No mask mandates, no more COVID.
Yeah.
So the people
right?
were wrong, I guess, right?
Yeah.
That's how that works.
Yeah.
I would love to use that same sort of power with my voice being like, and now I have $1 million. Like if I had that manifesting ability, I feel like I'd be much happier in my life.
Yeah. And I think what they've manifested is, this isn't my job, right? That's not what an elected official does, is pass, helpful bills. No, it's pushing through, this extremist agenda, which is not what they're doing. But and I'm sure Wesley can go into this a little more, but Progress Texas helped organize this really amazing rally outside the Capitol yesterday that brought together a lot of amazing organizations and let folks, go away with a message of fighting and hope. Wesley, if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, so as you said, it was a broad coalition of organizations that work in multiple different issue areas. So we had folks there to speak about criminal justice reform. We had people who were speaking about voting rights, abortion access, workers' rights. There were folks who were talking about the anti-trans bills that are being heard, and then LGBTQ rights. And really the main message of the entire event was what Diana has been saying already, which is that the legislator has misplaced priorities. They're attacking our rights, they're attacking our healthcare, they're attacking trans children, when in reality, there are so many other tragedies that our state has been experiencing that we voted for our lawmakers to go to the Capitol and fix, and that's not what they're focusing on. They're instead focusing on partisan conspiracy theories. They're trying to pass legislation that is expensive, when in reality, we need that money to be going toward affordable healthcare, to fixing our state's energy infrastructure, because it's been proven now that our energy infrastructure is not reliable. Our grid is not reliable. And so I think that for anyone who's wondering right now how they can take action against a lot of these bills, which this was also a big messaging point and a main theme of our conversation yesterday, was this legislative session is not over. We still have time to stop a lot of these bills. And so if folks are interested in how they can take action, you should really just, reach out to your specific representative and either call them, email them, and tell them that you're against these bills and for bills that would actually help our state, bills that address Medicaid, bills that address the energy grid. Specifically, if you're looking for someone who you would like to reach out to, we're encouraging people to call Speaker Phelan. Because he's the guy who really has the power to determine what ends up on the House floor. And his phone number is 463-1000. And so you can call him right now, leave a message. If you get a voicemail, try to call him again, but ask him not to let bills like the anti-trans bills like these voter suppression bills and these anti-abortion bans, don't let them make it to the House floor, because there are so many other things that our lawmakers could be doing right now.
To close this out for the day, we got one quick question from one of our listeners here. Ed, what are the chances of passing Medicaid expansion in the future?
That's a good question, because there is a whole lot of money dangling in front of us from the federal government to do it, whether we call it Medicaid expansion or whether it's something that looks just like Medicaid expansion, but we call it something different. I think, it came closer this time than it's ever come. A 7-vote margin in the Texas legislature out of 150 votes is a really slim margin. So I think that there's an opportunity, and we're going to have a special session this year. We'll have a redistricting conversation soon enough, but redistricting cannot happen during this session. It will happen later because the census data won't come in later, and we talked about that a moment ago. Maybe Medicaid can come back up again then, or something that looks like it. I would say the door is not shut, but I don't know how open it is, if that analogy works for you. We'll see.
Amanda, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go.
Yep. I think it's the theme of the day. Being silenced.
We've had technical difficulties the whole day. It's
the whole day.
It's great.
The whole day. But thank you, Ed, Diana, Wesley, for talking and getting through this happy hour and all of the technical issues we got to experience today.
I've got another surprise for you when it's over, too.
Good. Oh, good. Everyone who's watching and everyone who's listening, thanks so much for joining us. You can head over to progresstexas.org, follow us on social, and subscribe to our email list. If you're listening to us, remember to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a good one.